Hi everyone, thank you for joining this session. I'm Katarina Rankovic. I teach painting and printmaking in the School of Fine Art, and I'm also an artist. I'm going to talk about what it might mean to teach others how to make original contributions to artistic disciplines whilst living in the age of machine learning. Machine learning is an approach within artificial intelligence that has had particular success in recent years, including considerable progress within automating aspects of artistic creativity. The overall argument I'm going to make is hinted in the term machine learning itself. AI researchers teach machines. At the Glasgow School of Art, we teach humans. If AI researchers have managed to teach machines creativity, then perhaps there is something new we can learn from them about teaching humans creativity within the arts. In order to arrive at this argument, I'm first going to raise some of the apparent paradoxes involved in teaching others how to create novel outcomes within creative practice. After that, I will share some of the substantial leaps that have been made in machine creativity within the visual arts over the past couple of months. And finally, I will propose that insights from this area could be used to inform teaching and learning creative practice in higher education, as well as offer a possible example of this. So let's begin with that first point about teaching creative practice to others. When I think about the task of teaching art practice, I find that one of the most interesting problems in this area is that the actual outcomes of the learning process can only be determined in the future. This is because, as artists, we learn to manage, manipulate, and work with things that don't yet exist. We spend most of our time forging pathways towards outcomes that will hopefully be a surprise to everybody, including ourselves. This is in fact the problem of creativity in general. How exactly does novelty come about? How can artists design the pathway to a surprising outcome? Should they wait for inspiration, or are there methodical approaches to stumbling upon novelty? If such methodical approaches exist, must they necessarily be idiosyncratic and discovered differently by different individuals, or might there also be more generally applicable ones? When we see this sort of novelty appear in creative work, it can be exciting, and the work is then often called original, as if it originated spontaneously there and then, as if it were a thing of its own order. Although excitement in response to innovation is still very much exercised and warranted, nowadays we can understand originality to be completely dependent upon a tradition, a context, an existing cultural repertoire, and that in fact there is much copying, repetition, borrowing and rehearsing involved in producing original outcomes. But more on that later. For now, it seems that the notion of originality, at least when understood as a measure of innovation within a discipline, persists as an important metric in the judgment of creative work, and therefore an important dimension to teaching and learning at an art school. For example, in the guidelines for the PhD in art practice at Goldsmiths College in London, we're told that the PhD in art is expected to, quote, form a distinct contribution to the knowledge and practice of the subject and afford evidence of originality by the discovery of new facts and or the making of new artifacts and so on. So how does one teach or learn how to make things that have never existed before and which nobody can yet imagine? How do teachers write learning outcomes for students when they're hoping they will be surprised by students' take on what art is for in the first place? Maybe this is not as paradoxical as it first seems. Artists and theorists have long generated fruitful insights into creative processes. The previous century in particular brought a more thorough understanding of the role of tradition in individual talent, complicating older dichotomies of the individual and the communal, as in this 1919 essay by T.S. Eliot, in which he says that the poet writes with the whole of the history of literature in their bones, acting as a kind of channel through which novelty finds itself. And such theories of authorship as developed by poets like T.S. Eliot or literary theorists like Roland Barthes offer models for thinking analytically about how novelty comes about, what the creative process is, and who can be attributed with the original work of art. Now, a key point to make here is that when theories of authorship change, or when we learn something new about the mechanisms that enable creative processes to happen, it follows that this should have an impact on teaching and learning in creative disciplines as well. Theories of authorship keep shifting, and in turn affect how artists learn to be artists, as well as what tools they think they need in order to generate novel outcomes in their practice. As we will see, advances in machine creativity also imply such theories of authorship that we can draw from. And just to expand a little on this point about the impact of creativity theory on teaching and learning, in other work I'm doing at the moment, I'm considering the relationship between pastoral care and theories of authorship in teaching and learning within the arts. The starting point for this is that many art students appear to develop anxieties specific to creative practice as they begin to regard themselves as professional artists, problems that can inhibit experimentation and continuity in the practice due to a fear of failure or creative block. Could it be that some of these anxieties stem from implicit assumptions about what a successful practice looks like, what counts as a day's work? In short, assumptions about how creative practice works. To that end, it may be that engaging critically in a theory of creativity and authorship could have a liberating effect on students' practices. A mode of teaching that would be analogous to applying Bell Hook's notion of theory as liberatory practice specifically to artists' anxieties about creative practice. Until now, post-structuralist critiques of authorship and the production of meaning have been my ally as a teacher in probing these shared assumptions we have about creative practice. But it just so happens that we are now on the verge of a new revolution in our understanding of creative processes, only now the cutting edge in this area is not coming from artists or poets or literary theorists asking questions about authorship, but from a different area entirely, and that is AI and machine learning. A series of advancements have occurred in machine learning in just the past few months, which could have a direct and substantial influence on teaching and learning in creative disciplines, in ways that will probably impact upon all the schools at GSA. If post-structuralist theorists like Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida contributed to demystifying the figure of the genius and the act of creation, then the discipline of machine learning is taking that process of demystification even further. I'm going to show you one recent advancement in this area that is relevant to us, which is DALL-E 2. DALL-E 2 is an AI system that generates new images when given text prompts. It was released just over a month ago by the company OpenAI. I will now play some parts of a video they've made about its features.
Have you ever seen a polar bear playing bass? Or a robot painted like a Picasso? Didn't think so. DALL-E 2 is a new AI system from OpenAI that can take simple text descriptions like a koala dunking a basketball and turn them into photorealistic images that have never existed before. DALL-E 2 can also realistically edit and retouch photos. Based on a simple natural language description, it can fill in or replace part of an image with AI-generated imagery that blends seamlessly with the original. It's called inpainting. It can even start with an image as an input and create variations with different angles and styles. DALL-E was created by training a neural network on images and their text descriptions. Through deep learning, it not only understands individual objects, like koala bears and motorcycles, but learns from relationships between objects. And when you ask DALL-E for an image of a koala bear riding a motorcycle, it knows how to create that or anything else with a relationship to another object or action.
The way this works is that the AI is trained on a dataset of millions of images from the internet that had been previously labelled with text captions by humans. From that, the AI creates an internal model of an aesthetic space. This particular AI model was trained on 650 million labelled images. Through reinforcement learning, over time, the AI learns to interpret human visual cultures through natural language with increasing semantic accuracy. Let's now look at how Ben Barry, an artist who was previously the design director for OpenAI, has explored DALL-E 2's capabilities within the field of painting, which is one of the disciplines I teach. In April, Ben Barry published a book of paintings he generated by inputting text prompts into DALL-E 2. The book is called 1,000 Robots and was created in its entirety within 3 days. Let's flip through some of the pages in the book. None of these images have ever existed before. The AI has generated original paintings based on the text prompts that Barry gave it. We can think of the prompts as commissions. Paint me a robot in an impressionistic or rococo or cubist style, and it does it, giving you several variations to choose from each time. Barry commissioned and curated 1,000 of these paintings by DALL-E. When I look at these, I can appreciate their ingenuity, their skill, their originality, with the same regard as if they had been made by humans. Now, in public conversations about this trend towards AI-generated art, there is often talk about whether the work of something like DALL-E 2, even if it were to be improved, would be enough to qualify as art. In an interview with Kazuo Ishiguro, the author of a recent novel exploring the future of human and AI relationships, he notes that it may be possible that human recipients of art have a need to know that the work came from another human through some sort of intentional process. He points out that this is already the case with big-budget feature films. The films that move us, that make us laugh and cry, are in fact the result of a collaboration between hundreds of people. However, they are often advertised as the brainchild of a single director. This reflects an enduring desire on the part of human recipients of art to pinpoint authorship to a single locality, even if in reality it is diffuse and cumulative. But one thing we can see from these images is that scientists have cracked how to automate a creative process that generates meaningfully original outcomes. The outcomes are meaningful because they're not random. These images are fluent in art history. They are semantically congruent with the visual cultures that we as creative practitioners also recognise. They will potentially even begin to add and contribute to that visual tradition. Of course, one discussion we could have is how the emergence of such technologies will affect our creative practices, and as a consequence, teaching and learning within our disciplines. We could discuss how or whether we might use something like DALL-E 2 as part of our own artistic practices and as a part of teaching and learning. That's an important discussion to have because AI image generation is going to hit areas like painting as hard, if not harder, than the invention of photography did. Note, however, that the way in which photography challenged painting may have in fact liberated it. So we know from history that the challenge DALL-E 2 poses to painting and other creative disciplines does not necessarily spell the obsolescence of artists, but this does remain an open question. However, as important as these discussions are to have, I actually want to focus on what these advancements can teach us about creative practice in general. The very fact that scientists have successfully automated a process by which culturally coherent, original images are generated suggests that we as human practitioners may have some methods in common with DALL-E 2. methods that shed light on general principles of creativity, principles that we can plug back into teaching and learning within the arts. If we can locate those general drivers of creative processes, as teachers and students, we can become more conscious of the processes involved in our own creative powers. Long has the creative process been shrouded in mystery, and that mystery, in turn, acquired for the arts a mystique. Artistic talent was perceived as an innate gift, and genius was something that simply landed in a select few people out of nowhere. Is it possible, though, that along the way, this out-of-nowhere quality is something that we have become deeply attracted to? Is the mystique of the creative process and the artist something which is still clung on to, despite the last century's efforts to challenge traditional ideas about origination? It is perhaps scary to begin to see in DALL-E 2 the demystification of artistic processes take place, but perhaps it should be celebrated. A related example to this story is Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. In some ways similar to DALL-E 2, biological evolution constitutes an algorithmic process capable of generating new, surprising outcomes based on a repertoire of existing forms. Darwin's theory spelled the demystification of the adaptation of species to their environment, phenomena that were previously deemed too spectacular and too complex to be the result of an essentially computational process taking place in the natural world. Yet this demystifying process has not harmed the value placed on the study of biology, or the value biologists themselves place on natural ingenuity. Perhaps the demystification of creative processes may similarly spell a greater, not lesser, appreciation for artistic work. So, could it be that advances in machine learning may contain valuable lessons about principles of creativity that can be interpreted by teachers in creative disciplines for their students? I'll end by proposing one possible example of this. This is Ben Barry's acknowledgements page in his book 1,000 Robots. One of his acknowledgements goes to, quote, all of the human artists who created the lifetimes of art necessary to train this AI. Indeed, the greatest power that DALL-E 2 leverages in the expression of its own artistic ingenuity is the lifetimes of work by countless other human artists. Without this, DALL-E 2 would have no creativity and no originality to speak of. Compare this to a passage from Roland Barthes' seminal essay, The Death of the Author, where he writes that the originality of a work of art cannot be spontaneous and disentangled from tradition, but is rather drawn from a common dictionary of ideas. Today, big data from the internet has become a digital version of this dictionary that modern algorithms can draw from, enabling machines to model visual cultures in a similar way to which each of us also carries a model of a shared visual culture. In fact, it turns out that the dataset on which the AI is trained plays a very deterministic role on the kind of artist DALL-E turns out to be. It may even be the only determining factor. The artworks we saw earlier from DALL-E came from just one model of human visual cultures. If we train DALL-E again with a different collection or number of images, it would produce outcomes differently, like a different artist. Perhaps the determining role of the training dataset applies to humans as well. What this suggests is that we might wish to take the training datasets of human artists very seriously too. Not only that, but we can begin to theorize the unique artistic voices of our students as a direct consequence of their training dataset, the cultural materials they feed into the machinery of their practices. What happens when we begin to think of our own exposure to certain cultural materials as a means of designing ourselves as artists? To some extent, we are all statistical models like DALL-E 2, carrying a picture of the world and acting from within that repertoire. Here are some questions we could ask in our teaching. Is artistic research analogous to organising the training dataset we feed our own model of practice on? Should we tip the balance of emphasis towards training or producing? Can a reconceptualisation of authorship as heavily reliant on tradition help to alleviate some of the anxieties about creative practice which students experience? These are just some preliminary ideas about how we can draw from research emerging from AI and machine learning to inform teaching and learning humans in the arts. Hopefully, as a community, we will be able to draw further useful and potentially unexpected lessons about creative practice from AI and machine learning to inform our understanding of our discipline in the future. Thanks.